You're about to enter into a new world of knowledge, curiosities, and high strangeness. This is a podcast of Straight Up Strange Productions. This episode is brought to you by our Patreon supporters. Become a patron today at patreon.com/intotheportal. Scandinavian states and regions of the far north hold many legends of the ancients. Of powerful gods, horrifying beasts, and magical creatures that defy the boundaries of myth and reality. Norse mythology describes the realm of these creatures as they exist in the tree of Yggdrasil. However, could there be more to these legends? Across Scandinavia, people claim to encounter forces and beings not of this, shall we say, realm. Elves, dwarves, and even trolls are said to reside in their territories on the fringes of humanity, or sometimes even amongst the local populations. So join us as we explore legendary encounters and sites known as homes to these magical creatures, along with a special guest, tonight on Into the Portal.
Hello, and welcome back into the portal. I'm Amber Ray.
And I'm Andrew McKay.
And we're back with a very special guest. Hey, Andrew?
Yeah, I'd say so.
With us today?
One of our favorite people in the whole world, our good friend Justin Zenger from the Zeng This podcast. What's up, buddy?
Nothing much. Thank you guys so much for having me on. It's truly a pleasure, and I'm excited because we get to talk about some fun stuff today. Well, continue to talk about some fun stuff. Technically,
exactly. So, for everyone listening, we started this crazy little discussion over on Justin's show, which is the Zeng This podcast, which you can get pretty much everywhere. Is that am I correct?
If you're listening into the portal, I'm pretty sure you can listen to Zeng This.
Oh, hell yeah.
Plug.
So go check that out, you guys, because we covered, well, rather Zenger more so covered some really cool specific stories having to do with things like Thor's hammer and connections with some of the creatures that we're going to talk about today. Mm-hmm. More of the sort of the detailed storytelling aspect of it, which is really important because it contextualizes what we're going to discuss in
the whole
tonight's
mythological
show.
Basis for everything, really.
Exactly.
I just wanted an excuse to talk about Ragnarok, so...
Yeah. So everyone wins, right? It's a win-win-win.
Yes.
Okay. No housekeeping today, you guys. We're skipping it because we just want to dive right into this. We'll have time for some housekeeping next week's episode. Okay. So you gleaned this from the introduction, but today we're talking about some monsters. I'm air quoting here, saying humanoid creatures, if you will, of myth and legend, and of course, seen in modern pop culture and fantasy, and these are Scandinavian creatures that are dwarves, elves, trolls, and hinderfolk, depending on... What's that, sorry?
Hildefolk.
Yeah, that's right. Depending on where exactly you are, Iceland, Norway, Finland, Sweden, all these Scandinavian states have sort of subtle variations of what we're going to talk about today. But the crux of the episode is this sort of hilarious fact that I find extremely fascinating, and obviously you guys do too, that some of these people that live in these states believe these creatures to be very, very real, and consequently people who research this stuff all across the pond where we are tend to believe that they could possibly be real or have been at one point real as well. Mm-hmm. So let's kick things off by talking about elves. Does that sound good to you guys?
All right.
I have questions, but I'll let you guys talk first because you might answer them.
Okay, cool. I just want to do a tiny little intro on elves, and then there's Zenger's question block right beneath that. So one of the things that we kind of talked about in the part one with your episode, Justin, was the idea that there's kind of a lot of blurring with these stories. And it's tough to kind of distinguish, for example, when we're talking about giants and then the association with very large things, and then we end up talking about trolls, for example, or dwarves sometimes being referenced in regards to elf-like creatures, or vice versa, and things like that. So it gets a little hairy. The lines between things like elves and other spiritual beings, even like the gods, which we talked about in your part one, it gets a little hairy. It's not exactly clear, depending on where we look, from Iceland to Norway or other places. These indigenous creatures can be very, very different. But specifically with the elves, I pulled this from a book called Myth and Religion of the North, the religion of ancient Scandinavia, and it talks about how elves are kind of mischievous creatures. I'm reminded of Loki a little bit from some of the stories you told at the beginning, because they're described in this text as ambivalent in terms of their relationships with humans. They can commonly cause illnesses with humans, but they are also said to have the powers to heal them. And essentially, they're just small creatures that remain hidden in rocky outcrops and remote areas of places like Iceland. So let's get into some more details on this, Amber. But before, Janger, questions. What do you got on your mind?
You just actually hit a nail on the head of something. Now, maybe it's my rereading of Lord of the Rings. Maybe it's my playing WoW a lot. Maybe it's my time spent in Skyrim. But you said little people, like smaller people.
Right.
For elves. When I think of elves, I think of 6 foot, pointed ear, have a bow, very ethereal.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, I've seen stuff like Disenchantment, where elves are referred to as these little, tiny creatures with pointed ears.
Totally.
Or Harry Potter, little, tiny creatures with pointed ears that are very mischievous.
How about Christmas? Very tiny
Christmas
elves.
That is correct as well.
If we want to chuck that out too, right?
So maybe it's the Tolkien aspect that's throwing that off a little bit. But I was wondering what description these are going to have. And since you said on the tinier side, I'm like, okay, all right.
Yeah, and I mean, when I say that, I definitely am not leaning towards like pixie-sized by any means, right? And not even in the sense like an elf, like the house elf, like Dobby the house elf. But certainly not necessarily this 6 foot plus.
Let me just intervene before you finish that sentence.
All the time is all I was going to say.
Because I have a quote here from Andrew McKay. Andrew McKay.
It's not me. It's
not Andrew McKay that's sitting here talking to us right now, but it's a different Andrew McKay. And he is actually quite a prominent author. He has this Life in Norway article. He's written extensively about Norse mythology, creatures associated with such, including elves. And I will just go ahead and say that Andrew McKay says that elves are tall, slim demigods, pale skin and hair, more beautiful than the sun. And that's kind of
the demigod
rough quote there.
Part of that description is interesting too. I want to come back to that because I think that's the distinction between the idea of larger versus potentially more dwarf-like or smaller.
True. And he doesn't go ahead and say 6 feet, but he does say tall. And he does refer to them as demigods, which in my mind almost speaks to like a similar concept with what we were talking about in part 1 on your show, Zanger, where you mentioned that the gods are not mortal in the sense that they'll die of old age. However, they could perhaps die of other things like, a mortal wound or something like that.
Right.
And that kind of reminds me of the elves to a certain degree. And also in the sense that a lot of times when you speak of elves, you're thinking of creatures that grow to be much older than the average human, right? Like hundreds, if not thousands of years old.
Definitely.
But they're interesting folk. And, it's funny that you mentioned Lord of the Rings right off the top there, Zanger, because I was definitely reminded a lot of that when we were looking into this, especially in the sense that they're more or less described as morally ambivalent in their relations with the human world, which is kind of what we saw in Lord of the Rings at the beginning, right? Where they were like, oh, like, I don't think we should intervene in this. This is not our war and la, la, la. However, although they are pretty much autonomous and they live in their own realm, which is Elfheim. I hope I'm saying that right.
Elfheim.
Go ahead and correct me.
Cool.
Yes. But anyways, they rarely are said to intervene in human affairs. But they do very helpful things, such as they can cause or cure illnesses. Right. And like I said already, they can also age at a much slower rate than human beings themselves. So they do have these sort of like supernatural qualities to them.
So they did really emphasize that in Lord of the Rings, I guess, obviously with her greatly outliving, oh my gosh, the name is slipping.
Aragorn.
Yeah, exactly. And
right.
Son of Arathorn.
Right. And then, of course, her father being, kind of pissy about how doesn't really care about anything other than elves, superior species, live a lot longer, yada, yada, yada. My hair is really straight. I don't use a straightener, whatever you may
I am a beautiful man and I don't need to care. Yeah, that definitely goes hand in hand. Like a lot of what we see visually in Lord of the Rings is what I've kind of picked up from, especially from this McKay article that I read. And even in the sense of these being like graceful, you know what I mean? Like they're very beautiful, they're graceful, these ethereal beings, as he calls them. And they do live in these naturalistic settings like meadows and forests, all that kind of jazz. So that being said, elves are not all that. Like, they have a bad side to them too, to a certain degree. And that's where we get into this, like, perhaps there's two types of elves, or like we covered in part 1 in Zanger, the idea that there's a dark and a light elf, and that these dark elves could maybe be dwarves. So we're already bleeding into that a little bit here.
Yeah, a little bit of crossover.
Yes.
Did you want to throw out these couple of names here? Do you want to attempt to pronounce these?
Not really. I will say that the two groups are known in anglicized terms as being blacker than pitch and lighter than the sun, just to give you a nice little bifurcation there.
Okay. I like that.
However, as McKay notes, not this McKay, but the other McKay,
right.
He says that this is actually disputed by many scholars, and that this could be an attempt to introduce the good versus evil concept. So this could be like almost like a Christianization to a certain degree.
Yeah, which makes things even more muddied and blurry, obviously, because we're looking at the crossover from like Germanic creatures and beliefs and like nomadic populations that then settled these Scandinavian states. And then there's these stories bleeding in with like different tribal stories and stuff, and that's all oral tradition. And then we've got the Christian stuff that comes in later. So yeah, it's a little bit strange, but I wanted to throw up these questions to you, Justin, before we keep moving here, because we've got the realms of the elves. So the Alfheim being one, and then I'm just gonna make you pronounce that second one there, the realm of the black elves. Maybe you could speak to these two realms here.
There you go. That was good.
Svartalheim, also, as I pointed out in part 1, also known as Nidavellir.
Right. Yes.
Which might sound familiar to some of you MCU fans, because yes, that was mentioned in there. We also got introduced to dwarves as well. And you got introduced to a lot of that stuff if you watch an MCU film. As I said, though, that's a whole different realm of me explaining the problems and differences there. But yes, but as I said with Svartalheim or in Elfheim, Svartalheim, black elves, but also that's the same realm the dwarves are from, allegedly.
Right. Right.
So is it just like a conflation of the two to a certain degree? You know what I mean?
It could be.
The idea that they're almost, like for lack of a better term, like genetically related in terms of the mythology in some way. Like they're almost like not ancestors because they're existing at the same time, but that's just sort of a weird distinction there, especially when we get into some modern stuff that we're going to talk about in a second, when people say encounters with elves, as I'm air quoting here, in places like Iceland. Which ones are they dealing with is my question. You know what I mean?
Another way you could look at it potentially is the idea that this light versus dark, good versus evil, better versus worse. This is just my own phrasing, but the idea that dwarves are seen as diminutive creatures to a certain degree, and perhaps are just seen as lesser, even though they make these incredible things. But anyways, that's just me imposing a hierarchy that may or may not exist.
Also, you're imposing good and evil on something that could technically not have it even.
Right.
Well, exactly. And that's what McKay gets into in his article there, is the idea that was this just a superimposition of these terms, good and evil and all this kind of thing? Did it come much later? Right. Yeah. So we did kind of we dug up, of course, you're on Into the Portal here, so we're talking about perhaps some real encounters with these creatures. So we're going to a couple of different articles here discussing how elves are perhaps an everyday thing in Iceland, things that are acknowledged by the government, also by multi-million-dollar like construction firms and building projects.
It's something they have to deal with, and this is a very
allegedly
stark contrast from the straight up mythology that we were talking about in part 1.
Well, exactly. It seems like the elves are coming out of their realm into the realm of humans,
so to speak. So before we even jump right into this, Justin, do you have any thoughts on that? Have you heard of anything like this before, beyond the mythology?
So I've heard stuff with like the Hildefolk and stuff like that, gnomes, more or less in Iceland, to where like they'd avoid building like roads and stuff because there's but I've heard that that's drastically exaggerated, but at the same time, I'm like, I don't live there, so I don't know. But I mean, Norse mythology is something that's still relevant there and in other parts. So, I mean,
yeah.
And also, as I've said before, Troll Hunter, I know it's fake, but I mean, at the same time, this could totally be real.
And don't you just want it to be?
Exactly.
I think I say that every 5 minutes when I'm watching that movie. I'm like, damn it! Like, I just want this to be found footage so bad.
You were saying the same thing when we were watching Kong Skull Island the other day. Like, why can't these things be real?
Yeah. Why can't we find an uncharted island in the South Pacific still? That would be great. I would be all over that.
No, I mean, I find interesting, and I'm very intrigued to hear these reports and stuff you guys that we are about to dive into.
Indeed. Well, let's get into it then, Amber. Let's talk about this.
I've got a few here. The first is from a South China Morning Post article dated from May 2016, and it's titled, "No Doubt Iceland's Elves Exist. Anthropologists certain that creatures live alongside regular folk." Love that. And so this actually is discussing how these invisible people known as elves are something that locals just have to deal with. And like I already mentioned off the bat here, examples such as moving construction sites to prevent meddling with elves, things like fishermen refusing, I should say, to go out to sea because of warnings they believe to be from these invisible things.
Right.
Or visible to some, invisible to most. And there's this guy I dug up in this article, Magnus Skarfendinsen. Hope I'm saying that right.
Close enough.
Anthropologist. And after decades of research, he actually believes that elves do exist. Figuratively or physically, or I don't know. But he goes on to tell of 2 stories he's collected. The first one was from a fisherman who claimed he could see these elves that are invisible to most. However, one day, so this is a guy, he goes out to sea every day, and he's like, it's just a thing, right? He sees the elves go out, and he goes out with them. They go fishing, he goes fishing.
Interesting.
However, one day, he noticed that the elves did not put out to sea. And he heeded their warning, despite the fact that it was a beautiful day out. There didn't seem to be any reason not to go out to sea. And he decided despite, maybe some laughs and some scolding or whatever, he told his colleagues the same. Do not go out to sea. There was a terrible storm later that day, and all who heeded his warning were safe. However, many boats did not return, and they were lost to the ocean.
Interesting.
Yeah, so the elves they know something. They're smart people here.
The whole thing with being invisible too, that whole thing is I want to come back to that later, the idea of being literally invisible and or invisible because they live in places that people can't find. Like it's more figurative, right?
This was almost described as a seer, like that's how he described himself. And there are various individuals that will do the same, and we'll get to them too. And they claim to have this affinity with these invisible folk. You can kind of see beyond the veil and into something else.
Yeah.
He had another story, though, this anthropologist, Magnus Skarfendinsen, I don't know.
Getting closer every time.
Skarfendinsen, yeah, exactly.
You got the first name down.
I just need to practice before we actually sit down and record.
Yeah, that's good.
But this one's even weirder, and it came from a woman that was in her 80s. And this encounter occurred in the early 2000s. It was 2002 when this elderly woman ran into a young teen who claimed to know her. Asking where they had met, he gave her an address where she had lived 53 years ago, where her daughter had claimed that she had played with an invisible boy. And so it was the daughter of this elderly woman that actually encountered this boy, but the boy recognized the mother and approached her. And so when the mother actually confronted her daughter about it and described what this teen, quote unquote, looked like, she was like, "Mom, it's Muggy," or Mudgy. I don't know how they pronounce it over there. Mm-hmm. But apparently, so this was a childhood friend of hers that had aged about 5 times slower than a regular human being, according to this anthropologist. So that was weird, man.
Yeah.
That, again, speaks to the longevity of elves and how they can coexist amongst regular folk, perhaps invisibly, but they are actually there.
Right.
Another interpretation of that. What do we think of those stories?
I'm going to let you go first, Justin. Let's hear what you think about that.
Okay, I'm going to say this right now off the top. If either of my kids or any of my kids comes up, especially the younger ones, comes up to me and says, "I'm playing with an invisible something something," I'm not. We're moving immediately. I'm just making that clear first.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, the thing I've been thinking in the back of my mind while you're telling me this stuff is like stuff that's been passed down through families, like old wives' tales, stuff like that. And the fisherman one, as somebody who fishes, not professionally or anything like that, but just for the, fun of it, there's a lot, fisherman's tale, stuff like that. There's a lot of like lore and stuff with like going fishing. It's like, oh, it's doing this outside. You should use this. It's stuff that's passed down like orally between fishermen, and I can see passed down, from father to son, and so on and so forth. So this whole report of this fisherman, could have come from his, his father and his father's father, and so on and so forth, telling them, oh, hey, did you see that? If you see this, don't go out to sea.
Right.
And the thing you're seeing is the elves out there, and stuff like that. So I can see it being more as there's signs he saw. Because to this very day, if I'm driving or if I'm out and about and I look and I see a tree and the leaves are blown over to where like you can see like the discolored underside of leaves, I'm like, oh, there's a storm coming. Is there one? I don't know. It's just my grandmother said that constantly when I was around her when I was younger.
Yeah.
So it's something that is embedded into my brain and will probably be embedded into my kids because I probably mutter it every time I see it. I'm like, oh, there's a storm coming. So it's one of those things that it's like, could that have been how he knew to look for these things? And could that have been like warning signs that they had always been told, but it was elves when it was really just like, oh, common things that could have shown there's a storm coming that you don't physically see yet.
Yeah.
So that, for the first one, that's kind of my take on that is there something there? Maybe, but there could be a much easier... I'm not trying to be a wet blanket.
No,
I
more
swear.
allegorical. And we come across that a lot, right? Like,
or more mundane to a certain degree.
Sure.
The quote from the article was, "The fisherman was able to see elves and would also go out to sea to fish. On the morning of February 1921, he noticed they were not heading out to sea, and he tried to convince the other fishermen not to go out either." So either he's like seeing things that other people aren't seeing, or he's claiming to see them and attributing it to that when it's actually other more natural or mundane reasons, like you're saying there. Which I can definitely believe too.
Right.
Who wouldn't want to say they can see elves?
Yeah. Yeah.
Unless you're going to be sent to the madhouse.
As for the second story, it fits a lot of the descriptions we get of elves, the aging slower. But it's just, I don't know, it's just weird because I'm like, that's just weird. I feel like there's two crazy people that ran into each other almost.
It's one of those strange ones. Yeah, it's it is just anecdotal, obviously.
Oh, totally, 100%. Yeah, it's interesting because to a certain degree, if you are an elf, even if you are a child, like if you have your own realm, why would you go into the realm of the humans, right? Like, what's the purpose? Like, you know what I mean? Besides to have a playmate, wouldn't you have other elven playmates that you can that are more akin to you, or is this like a fox and the hound kind of scenario here?
Yeah. This is something we come across a lot when it comes to ideas of things that can physically exist in our world but aren't necessarily from this realm or world or whatever you want to call it. And the idea of whether or not it's a clear, if you believe any of this at all, obviously, if it's a clear choice to, go through a portal or go through a crossing over point, or if it's just by accident or just because of the place and the context that things are seen. You know what I mean? It's not as if an elf opens a door and is like, I'm just going to go into the human world for a little bit. See you later, ma. Shut the door, and now I'm going to go play with my friend. It's kind of just more, there's areas where there's activity.
True. The weird part was the address, right? Because that lady lived there like 50 plus years ago, kind of thing.
Which it could be like tied to place. That's what seems to come up a lot with these things, where there's rocks that are known as the Elf Rock or Dwarf Hill or this, that, or a Troll Mountain or whatever it may be. It's very much geography related. There is some more specific stuff. Sorry, go ahead there, Zenger.
No, I just wanted to throw this out there real quick. This is me getting really abstract for a second. So you said, don't they have other elf kids to play with? What if they don't? Because, if they have longevity, maybe it's not a good idea for them to have a lot of kids. So
They're
it might
lonely.
be something where, you have a kid maybe every 50 years. And
True.
It's not, common for you to have a ton of kids around.
Small populations too.
What if this poor little elf child was like Robin and Winnie the Pooh, and he has to go to the 100-acre woods to find someone to play with?
Well, that's kind of what it sounds like, right? Where it's this, it's a crossing over point.
It's very whimsical. It's like not threatening or anything. Obviously, the woman was freaked out if this is a true story, and you have to take this with obviously a huge grain of salt here. This is coming from an anthropologist, so whether or not these things actually exist, the belief exists. In that sense, they do exist. You know what I mean?
Right.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
As it points out, Iceland is is a very accepting culture of stuff like this. Somebody coming out and saying this doesn't sound as odd as me running outside and saying it.
And that's something that it's tough for us to kind of make judgments on. I don't know anyone who's lived in Iceland or is Icelandic, but I think it's something a little over 50% of the population definitively believes that elves and the hidden folk do exist in some shape or form. And then the other another different percentages of the remaining 50% don't really know. They're sort of undecided. Which is really strange. It is totally a different culture.
It's almost like you don't want to deny it in case it's true, but at the same time, you don't want to overtly acknowledge.
Which is, but why? It's kind of interesting.
You just want to be ambivalent.
To go back to the construction stuff, because you brought that up, Zenger.
Yes.
I actually have one of those examples that was from the late 1930s, which is pretty interesting because it was taking place at a road near a really famous place that's known as Elf Hill or Alfhol. Something along those lines in the pronunciation.
That's really close to another word.
Alfhol?
Okay, never mind.
Asshole? Not really, but I guess.
Kind of. I don't know.
But this is the most famous alleged residence of the elves, and this is near the city of Udir. Kopavogr? Close enough. I have no idea. Zenger, you want to give that one a go?
No, I'm not.
Kopavogr.
Yeah, there you go.
That's hard. So this Elf Hill allegedly had construction that was supposed to begin right alongside a highway, right alongside where this famous elf residence was allegedly existed. And basically, the construction started, but it was delayed at first because of money problems, which was the first sort of strange thing because it was a company that allegedly had deep pockets. When the work finally did start, they encountered all kinds of problems, inexplicable problems. Machinery would break down, tools would just disappear, and the road ended up having to be rerouted because of all these issues around the actual Elf Hill. And the belief was at the time the elves were obviously interfering with the construction because it was taking place on their territory. Later on, this is 50 years later, 40 years later, the same road was set to be raised and repaved and sort of redone. But when the workers reached it and were about to do some demolition and kind of work on stuff, their giant rock drill completely shattered into pieces, didn't just stop working, but just fell apart. And then when they brought in a replacement, the same thing happened too. And at this point, the workers allegedly got so spooked that they just straight up refused to work there of fear of being, getting on the bad side of the elves. And this was a relatively recent story. So I'm going to throw it out to you guys. Obviously, this is, again, in Iceland where people believe in this stuff. But this is getting a little bit more specific.
I have my own theory on this. I might save till the end of the section. But Zanger, what are your thoughts?
So, going with my vague knowledge on this stuff, I heard that like construction sites would leave out tools. If the tools were left, like, hey, we're going home for the night, leave out the tools. If the tools were there in the morning, it was like a sign from the quote-unquote Hildefolk that it was good to work. Like,
That's
they were
cool.
okay to work.
Right.
I don't know how true that is with this stuff, but this, because it said that, to lost tools, broken machinery, it seems like there was something messing around with stuff. Bad juju in the air.
Yeah, and it reminds me, again, I already threw this out in your part one, the idea of Skinwalker Ranch and the, I think it was a post driller that just appeared at the top of a tree. Mm-hmm. It's obviously a very different entity or something, but trickster-esque, you know what I mean? Obviously.
Meddling.
Meddling. It's like, it's defensive if you believe that this is their territory, but it's also like, things disappearing, things breaking. It's paranormal, but it's also to be expected, I guess.
It doesn't have a mundane explanation, doesn't have a human explanation, or a more supernatural one.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
This doesn't end here, though, because I have a couple more articles that we can talk about here. And this was from 1971. And this was when elves disrupted another construction project of a national highway. This was heading from Reykjavik to the northeast. And this project, again, suffered a lot of unusual technical difficulties because the elves did not want their home, which was a large boulder in the area, to be moved. And this was interesting because this is where we get into negotiations with the elves on the part of the government of Iceland. They made an agreement. I don't know how they came about this, but they came to this agreement that they would leave the stone for a week, and they would then move the stone about 15 meters to the side so they could continue with their construction. This is weird. It's almost like this peace bond to a certain degree. It's like, we'll give you space to kind of like have your have your ritual, have your ceremony, and then we'll gracefully move this just a little bit out of the way and then continue on with our project. And this apparently worked. They were very gingerly lifted this massive boulder, and you can go and look at these online. It's huge, this thing. Yeah. And they gingerly lifted it up and placed it very gently in its new home, and the elves were supposedly happy. However, there was another encounter between the government and the elves in 2016 related to construction again. There was a rock slide, and they were cleaning up debris, and they accidentally covered up one of these rocks that was known to be an enchanted elven home. And nobody at the time thought of the rock as this one guy is, oh my gosh, Zofanayason.
Okay.
Wow. Okay. He works for the construction company, and he said that no one thought of the rock. And then when they realized what had happened, they obviously fixed it because they started to have like meddling again, right? Where the tools were breaking, all this kind of stuff. So again, there was a happy ending for the rock, the elves, and the people. So they unearthed the rock. This was the Iceland Road Administration. They decided that they would gingerly move it again. And they pressure washed it.
Yeah, cleaned her up for the elves. Damn.
Because it got a little bit
Special
dirty.
treatment.
But essentially the elves were appeased by this. And all hunky-dory after that. However, there was this one woman. Okay, so this is another person that claims to be a seer of elves. Kindred spirits, so you could say, I guess. And her, I don't even want to pronounce her first name, but I'll say Jónsdóttir was her last name. And she was actually witness to the upheaval and the moving of this stone.
Right.
She is also, I don't know if I should even say this, but she is known to be What would the term be? Like not a tree hugger, but like, like an activist, an environmentalist,
Sure.
yeah, that type of thing. So again, she's kind of known to live in this like volcanic rock part that's a highly regarded spiritual place for elves. And she's like almost like their conduit. So I'm not sure if all of these like negotiations were done through her or through similar individuals, that type of thing.
Right. Okay.
But that's where we kind of get into my sort of like, I don't even know, like this is kind of my, what would you call it? Like alternative theory, I guess, is like,
Sure.
Are the elves meddling with all this equipment, or is it activists? Is it environmentalists? Does it have a much more human cause, right? You have to entertain that possibility.
Yeah.
I thought you were going a totally different direction, so.
Yeah.
What were you thinking, Sanger?
You mentioned the volcanic stuff, and I'm like, Iceland is like super volcanic, and it could be leaking gases, and people could be hallucinating.
Seeing
In
stuff.
certain areas, yeah.
That isn't
potentially.
there.
I mean, the one counter I would have to that, the idea of activism and stuff, is that a lot of these locations, despite them being designated as elfin locations, they're not necessarily like, like if you're building a highway adjacent to an existing highway, it's not like you're exactly cutting down great redwoods. You know what I mean? Like it's not like it's a.
So this is their landmarks.
Right. Yeah. I mean, you had this point up here that was pretty cool, like the 2012, the idea of that rock being designated. It's protected as an elfin heritage site.
It is.
Which is
it's important to them.
Yeah, and like that's the strange thing, because like we have an acknowledgement from the government on the one hand, and it's like seen in the West and by people in Iceland as well as like a cutesy kind of a thing. I think, right? I think we can probably all agree on that. Yeah. That it's almost like
it's tradition and convenience.
It's tradition and convenience, but at the same time, it's like a lot of extra effort just for those things. So that's why it's interesting that you have this 50-50 split where there's people who genuinely do think these things.
I will say, too, it's very integral to the tourism sector of Iceland. For
yes.
to a certain degree.
That is.
So you have to have your...
Surprised.
Right? Yeah. So this is, again, another sort of motive to keep these places sacred. And I had this interesting little quote here. This was from Terry Gunnell, who's a professor of folklore at the University of Iceland. And he just kind of spoke to the idea that it's more of this folkloric nature of tradition that keeps these sites sacred. Then it's much more effective than government policy. He said here, this is a quote, "They're protected by stories about the bad things that will happen if you do... like mess with them," is what he meant to go on and say. This word of mouth passed down over generations is usually more effective than an official preservation order, which is, to me, again, it just speaks to the way it's entrenched in the culture.
Yeah, no, for sure. I mean, we got to get to Iceland. It sounds like a pretty sweet place.
Yes.
I'd love to go.
Totally.
I'd love to go to any of those countries. Iceland, Norway, Sweden.
All of them.
It's on the bucket list for sure.
Let's do it.
Let's do it. The three of us, let's go. Book the tickets. I wish I could afford that right now. Damn. Things, obviously, I have this little bit here I just wanted to add before we move on to other creatures. But obviously, like, the perception or like conceptualization of what an elf is has morphed a lot over the years. And like I threw out that bit off the top, the idea of like the different perceptions of size or what these things might actually be. And by the 1500s, people had essentially in different, fairy tales and things like that had just been incorporating them into stories, including fairies and other different creatures and stuff like that. And then trolls get involved. And, by the 1800s, essentially a lot of these creatures are really conflated and crossed over. And we've got all kinds of different versions from friggin' the fairy and Peter Pan and people probably thinking that that's an elf, you know what I mean? And things like that. We're going to avoid that. I threw out the Christmas angle too, the right jolly old elf of St. Nicholas in the end of the 18th century and stuff like that. Don't want to talk about that. We want to talk about more about the delineation between elves and the next creature that is dwarves. And we definitely have some questions for you, Zenger, about that specifically.
Yay!
Yeah, you seem pretty excited about it. But before we get right into dwarves, we have something actually kind of special here on Into the Portal. So we are going to take a really short break from our brand new sponsor. So take a listen. You know, podcasting is amazingly fun and we love doing the show, but sometimes things can come up that really lead to some stressful days and quite honestly, some tough nights sleeping. You know, work, bills, the recent loss of a loved one in our family, for example. Trying to keep up with things can get us down, you know, just like anyone else, and stress can really build up, and it's not always easy to find someone to talk to. So when we were approached by BetterHelp here on Into the Portal, we were really excited to talk about what they do. BetterHelp Counseling Service is a new way to get the help that you need when you need it, which, you know, let's face it, it's not always easy to ask for help. Well, now it is. BetterHelp offers secure, convenient, professional, and affordable counseling services.
Yeah, it's pretty incredible. This is a really easy way for you to get help on your own time and at your own pace. It's private and reliable help that's available when you need it. You can book video or phone sessions, plus chat and text with your therapist on your schedule and in a secure environment of your choosing, which is big when you feel like you need to really open up to someone. BetterHelp has licensed professional counselors who have a broad expertise in areas which may not be available to many locally. They specialize in everything from depression, anxiety, grief, family conflicts. And what's really great is that anything you share is confidential. And you can literally start communicating with a real person in under 24 hours in the format of your choosing. Desktop, mobile web, Android, and iOS apps.
And best of all, it's a truly affordable option. And Into the Portal listeners get 10% off your first month with discount code PORTAL, spelled PORTAL. So why not get started today? Go to betterhelp.com/portal and simply fill out a questionnaire to help them access your unique needs and get matched up with a counselor that you'll love. That's betterhelp.com/portal. Financial aid is available for those who qualify. So please, if you feel like you could benefit from this, check it out. And again, that's discount code PORTAL, PORTAL, to get 10% off your first month using BetterHelp.
All right, so make sure you go check out our new sponsor there. It's a really great service, and if you're in need of that type of thing, then we highly recommend you check it out.
Absolutely.
Now let's get into dwarves.
Okay, crossing over now. And to be totally honest with you, I mean, if I had to pick like a desert island creature from what we've been covering today, the elf stuff is really interesting. The idea of dwarves and what they're able to build and those legends just totally fascinates me. The idea of where they live, also hidden folk, very much like the elves that we already talked about, but different in their own way. So
they're makers.
They're makers.
They're pretty cool. And we've actually, I feel like when we were starting to do the research for this section, we started to have some crossover with other topics that we've covered in the past regarding little folk or little people.
That's right.
We'll get
that
into
build amazing things. So like we've talked about already, and like Justin covered in part one, these creatures go back a long, long way. They're involved in all kinds of different mythologies. It's kind of tough to exactly pinpoint because of different oral traditions. And then obviously we're dealing with things like sightings and real belief in these types of creatures. So it gets a little hairy when we're trying to pin down exactly where they came from or the origins of the word per se. But the Old Norse version of the word is Dvergr, or Dvergr, which is really hard to pronounce, which is in line with the species of Hudurfolk, or hidden folk, inhabiting interiors of mountains or different lower levels of abandoned mines, hollow spaces within the earth. Oh, that's a crossover, some weird paranormal stuff we've covered.
Goblins.
Essentially a veritable labyrinth of mine shafts and complexes beneath the earth, if you can picture this. And it just seems like the coolest frickin' thing in the world, that this is where the dwarves reside.
So unlike what we discussed, we kind of debated about the elves as far as size, right? Because we did see some references to them being smaller, some of them being tall, slim, demigods, all that kind of stuff. Dwarves of various types are basically all of a smaller stature, and some of these are no more than 18 inches high, 45 centimeters if you're in Canada.
Yeah.
So no more than the height of a 2-year-old child. And this is strange to me because when I think of a dwarf, I think of them as being like kind of like knobbled and ugly and like, you know, misshapen features perhaps and big ears and that type of thing. But sometimes they are described as beautiful.
Yeah.
But more usually they do resemble these old men with long beards, humpbacks, and all that jazz.
They're gnarled workers in the earth.
The gnarled workers that never see the sun.
What's your perception of dwarves in terms of the mental image you get, Justin?
I never thought that small. Like, that's small.
That is small. Like, and that is, like Amber alluded to, more in line with creatures like the Menehune, which are extremely tiny master builders from ancient Hawaiian lore, but are very, very similar to these dwarves. And we're going to talk about that a little more in a sec. But
See, I was getting excited for the sightings to where, like, some bearded, like, 3 foot tall person or so walked around with, like, a pickaxe and, was grumbling about, like, hi-ho, off to work he goes.
I know, right?
I was assuming that was going to be it, but when you said 18, no more than 18, I'm like, that's a lot smaller than I was thinking.
Some of them, not all, but some of them are.
Yeah, I'm still, though, I was thinking, like I said, once again, maybe reading Tolkien recently was not the best thing to do.
Yeah.
It definitely paints an image for you, for sure.
But in my mind's eye, for like when I was going over the Norse mythology stuff, I had always assumed these very swarthy, not like, definitely like someone that would work in the earth, a little bit, more squat, definitely beards and stuff and everything, but I didn't assume like that small and everything.
Yeah.
Like I said, so that's hit me for a loop.
I have a question. Would they be born with the beard?
Yes.
Or do they have to grow it with time? Almost like with the trolls in Troll Hunter, where it's like they're born with one head and they grow others as they age.
Right.
But anyways.
Not to give anything away, because we're going to get into that,
no.
obviously.
Exactly. So as we've already alluded to in part 1 with Zanger on Zang This Podcast, make sure you go check it out. These dwarves are master builders. They're makers. They're blacksmiths. They live in these underground cities. And these are extremely hard to find. They're hidden away from humanity, which is very cool in my opinion. It definitely bleeds into Lord of the Rings again for imagery in my head. Like, this grand entrance into this underground, like, craziness. What do you think about that?
I want to find one of these entrances. That's all I can say.
Do they exist? Can we access them?
The thing that this reminds me of, and I want to toss this out, is the idea of the Hollow Earth and different spaces, and potentially those being very literal and real, and being the access points. You know what I mean? So does that tie into this at all? Beliefs like that? It just wasn't articulated in the way we think of the Hollow Earth today, but spaces where these cities and these builders could like do their work. What do you guys think about that?
That's a common theme in a lot of mythologies and stuff. This, like, there's places under the earth.
Totally.
Hades, for example, in Greek mythology, is one. Technically, in Norse mythology, there's what we're talking about right now. Nidavellir is supposedly an possibly underground place.
Right.
No, it's a common thing. Hell, technically, I guess, too.
Sure.
In Christian mythology, Judeo-Christian mythology, or religions. It's a common theme that creeps up, but it's also, places that are dark, places that, humans would have trouble living in or being able to be our, primordial fear of the dark and of the unknown. Is there something right below my feet? It just lends credence to so much stuff that it's interesting.
No, for sure.
Think about. And that, like I said, when you bring up Hollow Earth now, you get an eye roll, but it's like, it's not referring to like the Earth's completely hollow. There's hollow places possibly where stuff could be. And that terminology, I think, is something that I'm not subscribing to it, by the way. I'm just saying that terminology like that is a little bit more digestible than the buffet-sized Hollow Earth of, oh no, there's a whole world under there.
Yeah, you can find the entry point and fly into it type of Hollow Earth
it's
theory.
more of like, no, there's areas where it's hollowed out.
Exactly.
And when I
go in
100%, that's why actually you referenced Kong already, Amber. They did a good job in that film on that point, because it was like, no, it's not completely hollow. It's just they found interesting spaces where things existed, and that's what I think of when I think of the dwarves. And maybe something
Yes.
very real finding a space to be. And we have some theories at the end on this, that this possibly could have popped up from very real human beings that were doing this, whether or not it was associated with stories of miners or whatever. And we actually talked about this in our goblins episode too, because there's some crossover with goblins when it comes to this stuff as well, especially when you go all the way back and connect it through language with essentially just Germanic nomadic populations and their beliefs in those types of things, goblins specifically. And the goblin tunnels in Germany that we've talked about.
Yeah, those were weird, man.
So, Menehune, just to chuck that out again, the reason that we obviously were reminded of them, they're similar description, they're master builders.
Do you want to give a quick description of those guys?
Yeah, sure. So, the Menehune are essentially, they're mythological creatures of the ancient Hawaiian Islands. They were supposed to be the first
descendants, the ascendants of the Hawaiians, the pre-Hawaiian populations.
They're the origins of the Hawaiian people.
Ascendants, that doesn't make sense.
Yeah, well, yeah, whatever. But what's interesting about them is that they're associated with like landmarks, right? So that's very much the same as these creatures here, the elves and the dwarves, where there's maybe a really specific rock.
These feats of engineering or other sorts of things.
Exactly. And it's so intimately tied to geography and like people's, I guess you'd say, respect for the land and like how proud they are of their place. And I feel like that's why in Iceland this is such a significant thing, right? But that I think that's why we wanted to chuck it out there, because they're known for building, for example, like this massive
breakwater,
which was built thousands of years before the first Polynesian settlers, so the legends go.
Or hundreds of years, I don't know.
Well before. And it would have been nearly impossible for people of their stature and at that time to have completed.
And that's where you get into what I was talking about just off the top here, where it's like, are we talking about small creatures? Are we talking about a diminutive term for these creatures, right? Is it like almost a derogatory thing? Oh, the little people, like, you know,
not when we look at the stuff that Justin talked about, I guess. I mean, what do you think about that, Justin?
So I just had an interesting thought.
Yeah.
Iceland active volcano. Menehune. Hawaii.
Volcano.
Damn.
Connections.
Or active volcanic areas.
That is actually really interesting.
And that is intimately connected to the underground.
And it's just weird that it might just be a weird coincidence. You guys brought up just two locations that had that. No, like I said, the stature of them, I think that's where we were at. The stature of them is something, like I said, that smaller size is something I would associate normally with, like, maybe gnomes or something like that.
Sure.
Oh, yeah.
Sure.
Which I guess the difference is, I don't know, gnomes are supposed to have beards too.
I know, right? And the Menehune had beards too, so like the physical description was very, very similar.
Gnomes have hats.
They do indeed have hats. Let's just jump back into rather some of the mythology stuff specifically on dwarves, because I added this under here, the questions for Zanger, the four dwarfs that you touched on very briefly. So I'm going to let you pronounce these again. Some of these, obviously all coming from these very detailed mythological stories. So
I got to pronounce these. Goody. The four dwarves, Austri, Vastri, Nordri, Sudri.
Yeah.
Boom. Nailed
East,
it.
west, north, south.
I probably butchered every one of those, and I'm proud of myself.
Yeah, we're proud of you too.
Dude, that was awesome.
Yeah, that was good.
So, which was the dwarf specifically again who built Thor's hammer? Refresh my memory.
I thought it was Brock.
Brock and... Okay, so there's something I don't think I really pointed out in that episode, which I will point out now. It's Brock and Adri. But sometimes Adri is referred to as Sindri.
Oh, okay.
But it's the same person. Once again, weird multiple names for the same person.
Right.
So, because in the God of War games, it's Brock and Sindri, but in all the mythology stuff I did research on, it's Brock and Adri.
Gotcha.
Different guy, same guy. We might never know.
Yes. Brock is the continuing thread, but the other name kind of floats. So I just wanted to point that. But no, they're... And then the ones that are the sons of Ivaldi, which I don't think are named in anything. And if it's off the top of my head, I'm not thinking of their name. I don't think they were ever truly named in at least Gaiman's.
Gotcha.
stuff. I think one of them is named in the Gospel of Loki, but once again, I don't remember it off the top of my head.
No worries there.
Apologies, but it's definitely not those names.
Okay.
These are quite, I would say they're symbolic to a large degree, obviously holding up the four corners of the sky. These actually were dwarves, correct me if I'm mistaken, but I feel like these were dwarves born from Ymir, that original, was he a giant or something along those lines?
Ymir?
Yeah.
Ymir? I can't remember how you say it, but
Ymir, yes.
Ymir. Yeah, sorry about that.
Gotcha.
Ymir, yeah, and a lot of him was sort of crafted into different sections of the world or realms, if I'm not mistaken. Correct, Singer?
Hold on a second, I'm looking it up.
He's looking it up.
Awesome.
Because I came across that briefly. Ymir, and the idea that he was a giant, she, hermaphroditic, and that it was like a lump that was basically born off the first couple of gods or something like that, if I'm not mistaken.
Interesting.
I'm mistaken about a lot of things, though, and to be honest, my brain is like working at quarter capacity at this moment, so, just bear with me there.
It's been a busy week.
Ymir, the first being a giant bigger than worlds, the ancestor of all giants. Ymir was nursed by the first cow.
Right. Yes. Okay, it's coming.
He's like the first thing that like everything comes from, and if I remember correctly, he's basically killed to make like all the worlds.
Right.
And everything.
Yeah, they bleed him dry. I think his eyebrows become one section of something.
Oh, yeah. It's all of his parts become different things.
Mm-hmm.
Basically, Odin and his brothers made the soil from Ymir's flesh. Ymir's bones they piled up into mountains and cliffs. The rocks and pebbles, sand and gravel you see, those are Ymir's teeth and fragments of his bones that were broken or crushed.
Painful.
And I know the eyebrows are in there. He was long dead by the time they were doing this.
They're like plucking out all the individual eyebrows. Or do you just rip it off in one go, just like a wax strip?
You know what? For this, knowing Norse, it was one at a time for the hopes of, some sense of, humanity. It was all done at once, but I know deep down it was not.
Deep down.
Yes.
Just to kind of like come back to what these things actually look like and the sort of strange different descriptions over the years. We mentioned off the top the idea of sometimes being described as beautiful, and that I see that as a conflation with elves, potentially, being different sizes and stuff. And then another reference seen as pale and ghastly in appearance, but without things like beards and some of the typical very Tolkien descriptions we might think when we think of dwarves, which is kind of interesting. And that obviously falls more in line with living underground and never being exposed to the sun, having extremely pale skin.
So if we want to go for a Tolkien reference for anyone keeping score at home, don't think Gimli, think Gollum.
Exactly.
Right.
Which is basically that description. Yeah, extremely pale. Still not,
Ghastly.
ghastly in appearance. A lesser entity in a way, if you will, but still obviously like they're known to be extremely intelligent, not only master builders, but just wise in other ways too. And I thought this was really interesting, Zenger, and you would really appreciate this because especially heading into a part 3, but the idea of not just master builder dwarves that live underground, but mountain dwarves that maybe live in slightly different locations. And this reminded me of the trolls, mountain trolls versus forest trolls, or the different types of trolls that they bring up in Troll Hunter. So I thought that was kind of interesting. Was there anything that you came across, like reading some of the more detailed mythology in Gaiman's book and stuff like that, where there was not just the realm of the dwarves, but maybe more specifics within the realm where it's like a mountain dwarf or different sort of types of dwarves within that? You know what I mean?
Well, like the Sons of Ivaldi are said to be like live in one area where like Brooke and Adri live in a different area.
Right.
But they're all in the mountains and stuff like that.
So this is like a more modern interpretation, probably from, Norwegians and stuff being like, oh, that mountain over there, or this mountain range over here.
Also, I'm trying to think, because I'm like, they just mention, the dwarves and stuff. They do mention that, they're in different regions, but they don't distinguish them at all, is the thing.
Right.
Aside from, there's this set, there's this set, there's this set, but they all sort of live in underground areas and different mountains and work metals.
Right. Mm-hmm. I've got a pretty specific description here. Part of it's from Britannica and part of it's from NorseMythology.org. And it's giving some details on the mountain trolls specifically, and the idea of them being organized into kingdoms or tribes with their very own kings. And this definitely ties into Troll Hunter, which I can't wait to talk about. But not only that, but they had chiefdoms and essentially armies as well. So I guess this sort of falls in line with the Ragnarok thing and having forces against the gods, potentially, right? And again, the story continues, like we've talked about already, living in subterranean halls believed to potentially be full of gold and precious stones, whether or not they stole these items or forged them themselves, like you talked about in your part one, making a boar, was it, or out of the skin?
They had a boar skin that they made a living boar out
So
of.
you'd like make something out of nothing.
And also living hair that was spun from gold too.
So so that's kind of fallen in line with this. Like they're potentially seen as greedy, I think, in some of the sort of versions of stories and stuff like that. But I just thought this was so cool because it falls in line, again, like I said, with the trolls and living in these caves and stuff in the mountains, but still having these very distinct sort of chiefdom breakdowns of how they exist. And this comes back to the idea of hidden folk. Dwarves being potentially invisible. They're seen in this reference from Encyclopedia Britannica. They're able to make themselves invisible, quote unquote. And whether or not that means they actually have that power, like the invisibility cloak in Harry Potter, or they just disappear into the mountains and caves beneath the earth, is sort of left up to interpretation, I guess. But yeah.
And it's funny, too, because, like, we were trying to come up with, sightings from the area, the Scandinavian area of the world. And in a lot of cases, I feel like a lot of resources either aren't translated into English, and a lot of the ones that are translated in English have a little bit of a touristic note to them, and they do talk more about sites as opposed to actual sightings of these creatures.
Yeah, exactly.
And maybe this is because these dwarves live in their own part of Midgard, a place no human could find.
That's what they say.
Perhaps, but I thought it would be fun just to dig up a couple of places where you could possibly encounter these mythical creatures known as dwarves. And the first that I located was east of Foss. Another butchery here.
You can do it.
I feel like it's a silent D. Dverghamdar? I don't know. Sorry. That's just garbage.
God, man. Tough
But it
languages.
It's basically a formation of basalt columns, and it's known as the Dwarf Rocks. And typical to Iceland, it is a protected natural monument. There will be no construction, no demolition, no nothing going on here besides the dwarves doing their thing. So I thought this was really cool because it's very impressive when you look at pictures of it.
Yeah.
These columns and just the whole facade of this sort of monument, if you want to call it that. And it was made by cooling volcanic lava. Another reference to volcanoes here. So coming out of the earth. All right. Subterranean. All right. There we go. Yep. And because these columns, as they're cooling, they're subject to contraction forces, as it's known. It causes these impressive horizontal cracks, which just leads to this, like, it almost looks like it was constructed, like, in ancient times, almost similar to Nan Madol in the Polynesian sort of area. There's not Polynesian, the Pacific.
Yes.
Anyway, so this site known as Dwarf Rocks is believed to be home of these mythical creatures, though, like I said already, sightings are rare if they happen at all. And if you have an encounter with one of these, it's probably more of like a spiritual thing than like a little man just came out from a rock and talked to me for 10 minutes and then disappeared or something. You know what I mean?
Which doesn't mean it didn't happen. It's just
True.
not necessarily a physical, hey, I have a beard, I can reach out and touch you entity.
I'm going to touch you with my beard.
I'm going to flick my beard at you.
Yeah. So that was one that I pulled up here. There's another location known as, I don't even want to say it, but it's known as the Rock of the Dwarves. I'm just going to say the anglicized term for it. And it's in the eastern part of Iceland here. And this is a really incredible rock. It's a singular rock. It has kind of a peak at the top of it. Mm-hmm. It's pockmarked but smoothed by oceanic forces of a previous age. It's very impressive. It almost looks like there's tunnels going into it.
Yes.
Which some of them are so large that you can stick your head inside of them. So
for a dwarf.
Again, I don't have the exact height of this rock. Sorry, guys. I should have pulled that up there, but it's very intriguing, very spiritual looking.
Zanger looks like he's got the pronunciation for this word.
Oh, do you? Or are you just looking it up?
It is a silent D.
Yeah.
According to the pronunciation thing I got.
Okay.
Vergastine?
Vergastine.
Cool.
Is what the pronunciation.
Nice.
Is what the Hawking voice just attempted to say. So.
Perfect.
Okay. So this rock does have a lengthy history, and it has a nice story to go along with it here. The story goes that there was once a vicarage at the east of a nearby fjord. And this rock was situated beside it. So vicarage, it's a spiritual, religious site.
Sure.
And it was always referred to as the home of the dwarves or the Rock of the Dwarves, even in those times. However, shifting populations, it's not a densely populated area. And because of these shifts in populations, at one point it was decided that they needed to move the vicarage in order to serve the locals better. So the rock was left behind, and they moved it to the other side of the fjord. However, the story continues here. The builders were sort of, reassembling the vicarage, getting it all prepped and ready when they noticed a, quote, house sailing across the fjord towards the new site. When it arrived on the shores, it was none other than the Rock of the Dwarves. Yeah.
Crazy.
Sailing towards the church. And they actually planted it beside the church, and it remains there to this day. And it was kind of funny because they described it as when it landed, they were amazed to see it was this rock complete with the inhabitants. So I don't know if they could see them or if they were implied to be there.
Right. Interesting.
Exactly. And this church was located at this location until the early 1920s. However, as the population decreased, it was again moved.
Gotcha.
And the rock remains. It's a solo rock now, so it didn't make another travel. But anyways, I would highly encourage anyone to go look at this rock and the other places that I've mentioned. They're both very intriguing. There's a couple of English blogs or English translated blogs on them too, including Guide to Iceland. They have some really cool resources on their webpage there. But anyways, what do you guys think of that?
I just think it's so cool how all of this is so intimately connected to the land. You know what I mean? And and landmarks that people are proud of. And it just makes me want to go and see this and maybe have a spiritual experience that's associated with elves and dwarves. And that's why people in Iceland and these countries feel like these things are real.
What do we think about the connection between this vicarage and the dwarves?
I don't know. Justin, what do you make?
Between the church and the dwarves?
Yeah, is there some sort of connection? Is this, again, like we've kind of alluded to before, is this a Christianization of traditional mythology and, that type of thing? It seems kind of strange that the dwarves would be drawn to a vicarage unless there was some other spiritual presence or reason for them to be there. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
If you want my opinion on this one, I think it's a story that was handed down involving dwarves. When Christianity started to become more popular in the area, they attached Christianity to it to make it appeal as a story that can continue to be told.
Exactly.
But giving the same message.
Yeah.
Off. I mean, that's just my guess on that from my interpretation of that. I don't think the the Christian stuff was involved to begin with, per se,
Right,
but
Exactly.
I think it got added on there.
The rock was already known as the Rock of the Dwarves, so perhaps the vicarage set up shop beside it because it knew it already had spiritual significance. And like you said, Zanger, yeah, they could kind of tie in this sort of already, it's already a legitimate or seen as an authentic sort of spiritual or sacred place. So let's put a vicarage right beside it and then just kind of continue to feed that sort of idea.
I know there's a term for it, and I cannot remember it off the top of my head, but a lot of early churches were built on like ancient sacred sites for Norse mythology. As sort of a, this is your sacred site, we're moving this sacred site here to kind of, let's transition you from worshiping this to worshiping this. Also, if I remember correctly, and please don't anyone quote me on this, I think the Celtic cross originated from them altering Thor's hammer medallions, if I remember correctly.
I have not heard that, but we can dive into that, and it kind of makes
sense.
sense.
It's just like I'm going off the top of my head with stuff right now.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, a lot of the stuff, I'm looking at here is just showing like a few of them are like transition. I mean, it's not that hard to see how they could do it.
Sure. No, for sure.
Yeah, totally. I immediately, as soon as you said like, oh, sacred place that's like, either pagan or some other religion, and then Christianity plants itself on top. There's so many famous examples of that, even in Jerusalem, right? Where they're still fighting over it to this day.
Yes. Because, you're trying to get the, not to belittle religion, anyone's religion or anything, but
No.
It is documented that, a lot of stuff, especially with like the Norse and stuff like that, were when Christianity came in, trolls, stuff like that, a lot of the gods were changed into different stuff for, we, this still exists, but it's not this. It's not capital G God sort of thing. We have capital G God. And, but I can definitely see that. Of course, they adapted to, you come to this place to worship. We're going to build our church here for you to still, you still come to this and slowly swap it.
Slowly becomes naturalized over time.
Yeah, exactly. And I totally buy that. Obviously, we're always trying to find the real nuggets of gold.
Well, that's just it, though. Yeah, exactly. There's a nugget that's a pre-Christian nugget way beyond the vicarage, right? It was already kind of acknowledged.
Well, and that's the other thing, as I was explaining in the other episode with, the Aesir and the Vanir gods, it's like it could have been the same thing to where, we have this set of gods called, that we, Odin and the Aesir. Oh, well, we have this set of gods called the Vanir. Oh, well, why don't we, let's slowly swap them together, and it's one thing.
Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah, I really can see that with a lot of stuff with, Norse mythology and all that stuff. And, a lot of mythologies and stuff like that and religions have a lot of common threads running through them for multiple reasons. But, no, I just wanted to point that out because that is interesting.
Yeah. No, definitely. I wanted to just pepper in a little bit more of a modern potential, air quoting here, sighting of a dwarf. Because it kind of ties into some of my theory stuff here and the idea of tunnels and places where things could exist and stuff like that. I pulled this from a straight up just cryptozoology blog. And this was in like the comments, like people were giving their stories and stuff, right? So it's almost like a subreddit type deal where it's purely anecdotal. Yeah. But somebody had claimed to have found this story that was written in a diary from 1138 somewhere in remote Germany, where there was allegedly a monk who was in control of a monastery in this small little village, and he had a story where he wrote down that he had an encounter with, quote unquote, a dwarf. Now, the story goes that he essentially came back into the basement, the cellar of the monastery at one time, and there was a creature there. It had entered somehow. He didn't know where the entrance point was, but it was extremely dark, almost black in color, as if it had crawled out of the earth, and didn't speak any known language, so to speak. And the monk allegedly captured this dwarf, tied it up by a rope, but after a little while, let the slack off of the rope to kind of see if this thing would run or if it could communicate with him in any other way. He allegedly locked the door left it down there, but when he returned shortly after, it had escaped, it had left, and there was an overturned stone in the floor where it had essentially gone through a tunnel existing underneath the monastery and escaped. Of course, there's a hardcore Christian angle to this. Obviously, This is existing in a monastery, and then this alleged tunnel that it escaped into was then sealed with a plate with a cross marker on it, as if to imply that this creature was coming up, I guess, from the depths of hell, and or something that just wasn't kosher. I guess.
Interesting.
So I thought that was a kind of weird story. Obviously, this is 1138, way more modern than some of the stuff we've been talking about so far.
Well, more modern.
Well, like from the ancient mythology.
Oh,
like
okay.
the stuff from
Not from the last story, from the 1900s.
Yeah. Not that, but in terms of the origins of the creatures, right? But I thought this was really interesting because it ties into the idea of the Erdstall tunnels that we talked about in our Goblins episode.
The underground access.
And potential theories for how the ideas of underground builders actually came to be. So I pulled this quote from lifeinnorway.com, and you'd referenced, was this the McKay? I can't remember exactly. I'll have to pull it up again.
Perhaps.
Andrew McKay, not me. Other Andrew McKay.
Well, that's
Very convoluted. Anyway, this is a quote that I thought was really interesting because it says, unlike this, and this is a quote specifically to, he references them as trolls, but this is purely reminds me of all the dwarf stuff we've been talking about. So it reads as follows: unlike their forest-dwelling cousins, quote-unquote, cave trolls live completely underground and genuinely depicted as smaller than humans, with a large round abdomen and short stubby arms and legs. That is much more of a description of a dwarf. And there's obviously, once again, this crossover here with that, where it's these are miniature trolls in the earth.
We've gone from a crossover with elves and dwarves, and now we're going to dwarves to trolls.
I know. So, I don't know. What are your guys' immediate thoughts on that?
I mean, I've never equated trolls and... Man, I really need to get out of Tolkien in my mind, because I'm like, oh, yeah.
It's tough.
It is, because he formed, like, our modern interpretation of a lot of these things. And I find it interesting because... like with the elves, as we pointed out, the whole, are they small? Are they these tall things? And none of the sightings kind of, I think, alluded to them being human-sized.
Right.
And these dwarf things are something that, I guess, you know what, I just put something together. Maybe the dwarves are the smaller elf versions.
See, that makes sense.
It does. So
I mean,
no, it's just all just like that piece just fell onto the puzzle, and I was like, wait a second, that works perfectly if they're just the smaller version of them.
No, it totally does. And the question is, I guess, man, I mean, there's more than just one question. There's a lot of friggin' questions when it comes to this stuff. I get, because I before I even forget, I want to come back to the Erdstall tunnel thing, because we're getting down into the end of the episode into some sort of theories, and it's tough to have theories really on this stuff. We've already kind of talked about it as we've gone along here with like the Icelandic government stuff and things like that. But
volcanoes.
I thought this was really interesting. Like, over the centuries, people have proposed the same thing we talked about in our Goblins episode, the idea that there were Norse and Scandinavian peoples themselves that were either of larger stature, so associated with like the taller stories of elves, or of smaller stature that were miners and worked in different positions that would have been better suited for tiny people. So nobbled small humans that could fit in these tiny holes, right? Which was very much the case back in the day. And we talked about that for these very strange and unsolved reason for the Erdstall tunnel systems in Germany, which normal-sized people can't fit through.
Right.
And there's discussions about whether or not these are entry points to a realm of the goblins, which is very much in line with gnomes and trolls and stuff like that, because it's rooted in Germanic language traditions. I just thought that was kind of cool. So an Erdstall, type of tunnel found throughout Europe, mainly in the southeast of Germany and Bavaria and Austria, thought to have been created sometime during the Middle Ages, although some people have claimed that these tunnels date back before the Stone Age, which would tie us into some of these ancient mythological creatures like the dwarves. I thought that was just kind of neat.
I love it. Everything's connected.
Interesting.
Everything's connected. So we're kind of at the end here. Final theories and thoughts. Let's go to Zenger first, just to kind of wrap up where you're at with this part 2, where you're at on the connection from the ancient stuff to people's belief in these creatures modern day.
So I guess the best way I can put this is when we proposed this, I was like, cool, I get to get Norse mythology out of my system. And then you were like, oh, we're going to get some, recent troll stuff will come later. Some recent dwarves and elf sightings. I was like, huh, okay. I was like, they're going to find nothing. And then you came at me with this stuff, and I'm like, oh, I drastically underestimated this. I found it very interesting and a nice little icing on top. Like I said, I genuinely had some revelations as we were going through this of like the volcano stuff. The, are elves, dark elves, or elves slash dwarves being the same, possible. Right. The same but different in different forms. So I found that all very interesting. And it was very eye-opening. Like I said, I knew a lot of stuff about, like, Icelandic, Hilda folk, stuff like that, in the sense of just that, they had a lot of respect for that stuff. But opening that up now with your information has definitely widened my perspective on that.
Cool.
That's awesome.
So we're teed up nicely to talk about my favorite of the 3, which is trolls for part 3. Because that's kind of the juicy nugget.
Yeah.
There's definitely some more encounters and sightings and stories, if you will, when it comes to trolls. And but Amber, what are your final sort of thoughts here before we wrap this up?
I'm not doing any finalities right now because this isn't wrap up for me because we've still got another part. But I will say that, Justin, it's kind of funny because we did the research on this end of this episode, but you're right. Like, I actually had a few revelations too. And it's kind of funny. It's like, this whole metamorphic / underground / volcanic sort of phenomena coinciding with these places too is actually very, very interesting to me.
Yeah.
And while we didn't actually come up with stories other than that 8-year-old woman who claimed to have seen a elven youth, we didn't actually come up with direct sightings per se. But in my mind, it's more interesting to just connect to the sites themselves and the larger picture, right? And just the cultural aspect of it.
Yeah. Acknowledgement from the Icelandic government. I mentioned that to our boss, Grayson, today, and he was like blown away. He's like, what?
Yeah.
They believe in that stuff? I'm like, yeah. I
know. And in my head, I'm like half thinking, is this for touristic purposes or is this like legitimate? Like they're like, we don't mess with this stuff, so we're just going to protect it. And that's that.
It's a healthy, even split is my conclusion on that.
Probably.
That it
is an even split. It's 50-50, right? People believe in it, people don't.
Totally. Totally. See, we'll have to go for ourselves and just find out.
That's what I was about to say. I'd love to go and just go in, not walking up to people and being like, oh, show me to where the hell. See if it just naturally comes out as something they're like, oh, go check this out. Because if it doesn't,
exactly,
to me, that's pointing to it's something that. But if it's just like the first thing out of their mouth is, oh, you're here visiting, go look at this site, or if it's something more of like you stumble upon it yourself, and then people are like, oh, I see you're checking that out.
Totally, and I think I said this earlier in the episode, but I'd want to finish with the idea that. If I can't wait to go do something like this, go to Iceland and talk to locals and figure stuff out and be sent. Yeah. Like you said, like don't force it, be sent to these places. But it's just interesting. The idea that, I don't know, just that people really do believe in this. I still can't really get over that. The idea that them being invisible doesn't necessarily matter. If you can go and have a feeling at one of these locations, but not necessarily see a tiny little creature walk out from behind a rock. Yeah, you might just chalk it up to a spiritual experience, but obviously for these people, it's beyond that. It's a spiritual experience, but with more like physical ties to the land.
Yeah, that's something that needs to be protected.
And it's that to me makes it more real. You know what I mean? It might not be real, like you can snap a photo, but that doesn't mean it's not real.
And
Very
it's
much
real,
like the energies at a Skinwalker Ranch, or
Oh,
wherever
exactly.
you might be, right?
It's real in the sense that it's been passed down for generations upon generations upon generations, and in that sense, it is highly steeped in their epistemological framework, right? Their way of knowing.
Sure.
And beyond that, into spiritual realms.
I believe in dwarves and elves, everybody.
I believe in a thing called dwarves.
Just listen to the rhythm of my breath. Yeah. All right. That's bringing us to the end here. Zenger, where can we find Zeng This? Give us the socials. Give us all the lowdown. Give us the deets.
Awesome. You can find Zeng This, of course, wherever you find great podcasts. You can also find us on Facebook. Just search Zeng This. That's Z-E-N-G this. You can find us on Twitter. Once again, search Zeng This, all one word. You can find us on the Instagram, but that's Zeng This Podcast. You can also, of course, find us anywhere online if you just search Zeng This.
Awesome. Mm-hmm. So thank you all so much for listening. Don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe to Zeng This Podcast and Into the Portal. It helps so much, you guys.
And go check out our part 1 on the Zeng This Podcast.
Exactly. Check out part,
if you haven't
part
already.
1 if you haven't already. And come join us where we're chatting about this weird stuff. If you want to talk about trolls and gnomes and elves and dwarves and all this kind of crazy stuff outside of the podcast, join us on our Facebook forum or the network forum, straightupstrange.com, and you can access it through that. So make sure you guys check out our network as well. Mm-hmm. And stay tuned for part 3, where we're coming back at you with our favorite tidbit and talking about some trolls. So until next time, on Into the Portal.
Your gateway to the bizarre.
This podcast is a part of Straight Up Strange Productions. Discover more shows like this one at straightupstrange.com.